All right, so today we're pleased to be in the presence of what many people consider to be the godfather of plant-based nutrition for diabetes. Dr. Barnard wears many hats. He is a New York Times bestselling author. He is a physician, and he is a clinical researcher who runs an organization called PCRM, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which is a nonprofit organization based out of Washington, D.C. that promotes preventative medicine and higher standards for ethics in research. Dr. Barnard has written 17 books, including Dr. Neal Barnard's Program for Reversing Diabetes, published in 2007, in which he clearly lays out a program that is designed to target and reverse the root cause of diabetes using a low-fat, plant-based, whole foods lifestyle. In short, there's nothing that this man cannot do. So we're pleased to have you on the summit today. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for including me.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it here. So for many people, the term insulin resistance is very vague. It's something that people have heard, maybe they've read about it, but people with diabetes can't really fully describe it. So you are a master biological storyteller. So how would you best describe insulin resistance?
Okay, well, let me see if I can do my best. It means you can't get the fuel into your gas tank, basically. Your car runs on gasoline. And as you can imagine, if you couldn't get the fuel into the engine, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to have any power. Well, your cells don't run on gasoline, they run on glucose. And glucose comes from food. And if a person has type 2 diabetes, what's happening is the glucose comes from the food, it gets into the blood, but then it cannot get into the cell where it can do some good. So most of the glucose in the blood is supposed to go into the muscles because of your movements. It powers your muscles. Some of it goes to the brain, it goes to other parts. But in insulin resistance, all it means is that the glucose is having trouble getting into the cell. And the word insulin resistance comes from the fact that normally insulin, which is a hormone that comes from the pancreas and through the blood, it's like a key that opens up the cell to let the glucose inside. And that's the problem. If you've got type 2 diabetes, you've got insulin. It's attaching to the cell normally, but it's not opening up the cell properly. So insulin resistance means the cell is resisting insulin's efforts and the fuel can't get into the cell where it belongs. So it's just like a car. It can't get gas into the engine. The glucose can't get into your cells. And so one of the first symptoms is fatigue. You just don't have any energy because you don't have the glucose inside your cells.
Great. So a lot of people think that sugar causes insulin resistance. Is that true?
It's really caused by the buildup of fat inside the cells. And this is something that nobody really appreciated this. But at Yale University, starting a number of years ago, researchers Gerald Shulman and Kit Peterson and a number of others used a technique called MR spectroscopy. And the patient goes into the magnetic resonance machine. It's like having an MRI for a knee injury, but they use a special technique where what they're looking at is not a broken ligament. They're looking inside the cells of the body. And what they discovered was that if you look inside the cells, you see buildup of tiny fat particles. And this could be in a person who doesn't have diabetes. They might be 25 years old and fairly healthy, but you see the buildup of fat inside their cells, and you know that's a person who is headed for type 2 diabetes. It might be 10 years from now. So in other words, the fat builds up inside the cell, it stops insulin from working. So no, sugar is not really the issue. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that a soda is health food. What I am saying is that the problem is the buildup of fat inside the cells, and that's especially animal fats, but I think you can overdo it with vegetable fats too.
Now, there's a lot of people on the internet that write about the fact that it's either sugar that's causing insulin resistance or it's insulin that's actually causing insulin resistance. I'm sure you've probably heard this before. So how do you respond to people when they say, oh, the reason you have insulin resistance is because you're cranking out too much insulin?
Well, you are cranking out insulin, but that's the effect, not the cause. Let's say my cell is not responding to the insulin because I've been eating chicken wings and Velveeta. And here's the process. The fat goes from the digestive tract into the blood, and then with surprisingly little change, it ends up inside the cell. that makes the insulin not work very well anymore. So I've got the buildup of the fat inside the cell. The insulin key no longer works, so the glucose, which is relying on that key to get in the cell, can't get in anymore. So my blood sugar is building up because the sugar can't get into the cells. And at that point, the pancreas says, what's all this sugar doing in the blood? And it starts making more and more and more insulin. And eventually it will get that sugar into the cell. But the buildup of insulin is a reaction to the fact that the glucose isn't getting into the cell.
It's a great way to say it, yeah. I love the fact that it's cause and effect, right? We're talking about the effect, not necessarily the cause.
Right.
So medical professionals always associate insulin resistance with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, but very few, if any, associate insulin resistance with type 1 diabetes. And when I read your book, I was very pleased to see that you make that connection. You show that in type 1 diabetes, you can also develop insulin resistance. So what would you say to somebody who comes to you and says, hey, Dr. Barnard, your program doesn't apply to me because, look, I'm skinny. I don't have insulin resistance.
Yeah. It's true that most of the folks that we see who have type 2 diabetes are often well into adulthood or maybe older. They're often overweight. But you can be young and you can be rail thin, and you can still have this disease because it's not the belly fat that's doing it. That's in a way another side effect of a diet based on animal products and other fatty foods. The problem is inside the cells. So you might be very skinny, but if you've got fat inside the muscle cells or also inside the liver cells, that causes that insulin resistance. So it's the intracellular fat, not the belly fat, not the fat between the cells. That may have other issues, but the cause of the insulin resistance is something going on inside the cell.
Very good. So in your book, you also talk about the fact that when you eat fatty foods, whether they come from the plant world or from the animal world, that they can actually inhibit gene expression, the fat burning gene expression in the mitochondria of liver and muscle. So can you kind of go in a little bit more detail about how that actually happens?
The most amazing thing, years ago, this was in 2003 and 4, we were recruiting for a research study where we wanted to use a plant-based diet solely for weight loss, just to see the weight loss that would occur from it. And so we brought in 64 women. They were all overweight. They were all after the age of menopause. Every single one had done every diet known to humanity, Nutrisystem and Jenny Craig and Atkins and everything else. And they really felt stuck. So we put them on a low-fat plant-based diet, and they lost weight very effectively, as you can imagine, roughly a pound a week. However, the question was, why are you losing weight? And the answer was really fascinating. The no-brainer part of it was, okay, you're suddenly eating beans and vegetables and fruits, and these foods have a lot of fiber. Fiber has no calories. So you fill up on high fiber foods, and your brain thinks that you've eaten a lot, but there's not really a lot of calories in your stomach. There's a lot of fiber. Fair enough. That's, I think, probably the biggest reason, along with the fact that fat is very high in calories, and if there's not a lot of fat, you're just not getting a lot of calories of any kind. However, when people came into the study, many of them said, something wrong with my metabolism. You know, when I was 16, I could eat anything. And now I just look at food and I gain weight. And they were right, because the reason that we know they were right is we put them on an exam table. We have a special canopy that goes over their face and their shoulders, and you're measuring their oxygen intake and their carbon dioxide output. And that, with some pretty simple arithmetic, will show you their calorie burn, their metabolism. And it's true, they were slow. So we then fed them a meal. And after you eat a meal, by the way, forgive me for this long-winded answer. I got to give you a little physiology.
This is great. Talk about
physiology. Okay, so we measure their metabolism. It's relatively low. They got out of bed. They came in here. It's first thing in the morning. We then give them breakfast. And then after breakfast, their metabolism starts to rise. And that's true for pretty much everybody, because you're absorbing nutrients and they're getting into your cells. And some of it you're burning off as heat. Some of it you're storing. Your metabolism rises for 3, 4, 5 hours after the meal. Then they go on a plant-based diet, vegan diet, low-fat vegan diet, 14 weeks. They come back into the center. They lie down on the very same table. We put the same canopy over them. We feed them the same test meal. But their metabolism after the meal was about 16% faster than before. You might say, could be pure chance. Maybe so. But when we then poured over our statistics and we looked at what predicted whether they lost 5 pounds or lost 25 pounds, it turned out that this after meal metabolism was a big part of why they were losing weight. So what's that about? Am I suggesting that when you're eating in a different way, that you can actually change how fast or how slowly your body burns calories? And yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Researchers did a couple of experiments showing it go the wrong way. Some researchers in Louisiana brought in a group of participants, put them on a high-fat diet as a test. And within a matter of days, you see their metabolisms are getting interfered with. What's happening is fat gets into the cell, the way we were describing earlier. Mitochondria, which are your little burners inside the cell that are going to burn up nutrients, they start slowing down. Wait a minute, what's this about? Why are my mitochondria slowing down? I just got all this fat in my cell. I should be burning it up. Your body is programmed to store calories because your body, if I can use this kind of language, your body was designed, or your body evolved a long time ago, back when starvation was a real thing. So when a big calorie influx happened, your body said, look, let's store this. Let's not burn it all up. And so if you get a huge caloric intake from fats, your mitochondria get less active. That stores the fat. Your body is insulated against the risk of starvation. The problem is you're gaining weight. And 1,000 years ago, that was great.
Right.
It'd have an extra 30 pounds, super. Today, no way, because every single meal you're eating can lead to obesity. So storing calories nowadays is not something you want. So what I'm coming down to is this: high-fat diets interfere with your metabolism. They slow your metabolism, according to the research that we've done. And when you get away from that to a low-fat vegan diet, there's no animal fat in the diet. There's very little of any kind of fat. There's enough fat, but not the excess. Your metabolism appears to rebound. At least that's what we think is happening. And so that helps people stay skinnier, but it also means that your cellular metabolism is getting back toward what it should be. So it's very, very exciting to think that you can manipulate that, and that change will occur within 3 to 5 days.
Yeah, that's incredible, actually, because it's not a very long period of time that somebody has to adopt a lower fat approach in order to see this change. Now, when we were graduates,
you see this with weight, the weight starts coming off within a matter of a day or two. Blood sugars start coming down within a matter of a day or two. You'll see people there. You might be very insulin resistant in the first couple of days when you're eating a high carbohydrate meal. Your blood sugar will rise, but very quickly, within a matter of days, it starts to turn the other way, and your blood sugars are going down and down and down. I'm not talking about waiting for 6 months. I'm talking about just a few days, and it starts to happen.
Right. So when we were in graduate school, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the cellular mechanisms of mitochondrial biogenesis, just what you're explaining here. And there's a lot of misleading research here that was just perpetuated by the low carbohydrate world and by the paleo world that says, if you transition to a diet that has a higher proportion of fat, then your body goes into quote unquote fat burning mode. And as a result of that, you actually end up reducing your insulin secretion, which then reduces body weight and so on and so forth. But what you're describing is actually just the exact opposite, that when you start to eat more fat, you actually suppress your metabolic rate, which then results in reduced ability to burn energy, period.
Well, anybody who doesn't believe that, I mean, you got to look around. We are in a culture of people eating a lot of fat. And may I say that that they are not fat-burning machines who are lean and healthy. We live in a country, in the United States, 2/3 of people are overweight or obese. Their metabolisms are not helping them. On the other hand, if you look at countries that either by culture or by poverty or for whatever reason, they were not eating cheese, they weren't eating much meat, and they were eating simple grains and beans. These were thin people, even if calorically they were eating a lot of food. I'm talking about people in Japan, rural China, where they're eating lots of food, but it's rice and it's vegetables, plant-based foods. They're skinny. And once in a while, people will say, "Oh, sure, but that's because you're bicycling, 10 miles into work every day." Wait a minute. The barber who lives above his shop and is just standing around all day is as skinny as his cousin who's been bicycling in. And people who are sedentary are thin too. So it's basically just an effect of a plant-based diet. And I really think that the paleo diet has crashed and burned pretty badly. in the scientific community. Nobody really regards it very positively. From a lay press standpoint, it's still got a lot of romance, because it makes us imagine that our forebears were effective hunters and kind of macho guys who could kill an antelope and bring him home and be adored by the waiting family. But that doesn't really have much to do with primate physiology.
You touched on this a little bit here, but when it comes to losing weight, a lot of people think they can just exercise their way to losing weight. Is that true or false?
Well, exercise in theory should help, because let's face it, you are burning calories, and that should burn off fat. But the reason I say in theory is the numbers are rather daunting. If I get on a treadmill at the gym and I run flat out as fast as I can for an entire mile, and then I wipe my sweaty brow and I push a little button that says how many calories did I burn? It's like 100. And then I look at a Dr. Pepper. It's got 250 calories in that soda. Oh, all right, let me run another mile and a half just to burn that off.
Right.
Exercise you can do, but exercise, your body is very efficient. Imagine if you burned off, a pound or two of fat every time you went for a run, you couldn't function that way. Human physiology is such that if you're going to be able to do athletic endeavors, you have to be able to do it really efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean without burning up a lot of body fat. And so that's what happens. So yeah, exercise is great. I'm all for it. I exercise myself. It's got many benefits. But when you want to really tackle your weight, it's all on the input side of the equation. Your average person is eating a couple of thousand calories a day, and you don't really burn off much with exercise. No, don't get me wrong; it's a good thing, but it's not gonna make you slim and trim.
Yeah, I used to be a huge proponent of the fact that your exercise accounted for like 70% of weight loss, and diet was about 30%. And then the more I read, the more I investigated this, the more I worked with people, the more I realized I was like, that is totally wrong information. Yeah. Absolutely wrong.
Yeah. But now exercise, let me make a couple cases for it. Exercise oxygenates your brain, makes you feel good. If there is some evidence that it can reduce the risk of memory problems later in life. And the other thing about it is when you're exercising, it's pretty hard to eat a bowl of ice cream. So I'm all for exercise in that way. The other thing is I've been very taken with why do people eat junk? And sometimes the reason they eat junk, I'm talking about cheese or meat, or for that matter, chocolate, or, it's not that we were really hungry. It's that we wanted to eat something. Well, what are we doing? In the same way that alcohol or tobacco or illegal drugs work by releasing dopamine in the reward centers of the brain, the neurochemical dopamine, junk food does the same thing. So you're all alone, you're feeling miserable. That is a time when you are at risk for lighting up a cigarette if you're a smoker, having a drink if you're a drinker, or eating junk food if it's in your refrigerator. So there are certain things that release dopamine naturally. One of them is intimacy. By that I mean talking with friends, being around people. And the more intimate it is, the more dopamine you get. But this is why support groups are so effective, because we're sitting around with other people, we're laughing, we're having a good time, we're high-fiving around. A little dopamine squirt goes in the brain, and suddenly chocolate's volume is just turned down a little bit. And physical activity does that too. Physical activity releases dopamine. So after a run, you're just a little bit less likely to abuse yourself. It doesn't mean that junk food won't have appeal, but when you're physically active, it just somehow makes you feel calmer and better. By the way, I want to tell you another one. Another one is music. It's amazing. Researchers have done brain scans on people while they're listening to music. And it gives them a little bit of dopamine too, because I don't know if you know this, but I do music professionally, have ever since I was a medical student. And I always thought, what the heck, why do people like drums and guitars and violins? It makes no logical sense, but it tends to release dopamine in the brain too. So what you need to do is throw out that Velveeta, instead put on a little Beethoven, go run around the block, be with some friends. Those are the natural healthy sources, and Beethoven has no calories.
Beethoven has no calories. Brilliant. I think I just recognized as you were telling this last story, your next book should be a children's book about metabolism, where you're relaying these types of stories to people.
That's going to be your next book.
All right, cool. Let's co-author it. Perfect.
No, I do have a book coming out, actually. Did I tell you about my new book?
No, tell us.
I got a new book. Here's the two things I got to plug. First of all, my new record my group is called Carbon Works, and you will see it on Amazon. You can hear little snippets. It's the wildest thing. I have 16 musicians I work with who are out of this world, and they're going to get your dopamine in your brain so much they'll never touch junk food again as long as you live.
I love it.
So anyway, Carbon Works it comes from the idea that we are all carbon, and these are our works. But my new book is called The Cheese Trap.
Right.
I know you've seen this all the time. There are people who say, "Oh man, I'm doing so great. I changed my diet. I feel super, but I really miss cheese.
I can't give up cheese.
Specifically cheese. Not ice cream, not milk, not yogurt. Cheese." You think, why? It smells like old socks. Why do you want that stuff? And so I started investigating, why do people get hooked on cheese? What does it do to them? What are the hormonal effects of it? And it's amazing. First of all, back about a century ago, Americans didn't eat much cheese. That was the French who ate cheese. The average American in 1909 ate 3.8 pounds of cheese in a year. Today it's 35 pounds is the average American's eating every year. Secondly, very high in fat. It's 70% fat on average. Very high in saturated fat, high in cholesterol, and sodium. Let me just end with this because I don't mean to give you a big cheese diatribe, but 2 ounces of potato chips, salty food, right? 2 ounces of potato chips, 330 milligrams of sodium.
Wow.
The Velveeta, 800. So all these people who think, well, cheese is high in protein, maybe so, but it's mostly fat, very high in cholesterol, very high in sodium. If it were any worse, it would be Vaseline.
Wow, I did not realize that it had such a high sodium load. That's actually really cool.
Load of sodium, load of cholesterol, load of saturated fat. And we feed it to kids thinking it's somehow healthy. We should get it off our plate. So anyway, I wrote The Cheese Trap. And let me tip a hat to Drina Burton, who did the recipe. She's a genius.
Yes.
Really wonderful recipes to help people kind of de-cheese their pizzas and their lasagnas and everything else.
Good.
Drina is absolutely a genius. She published many recipes on the Forks Over Knives website with us in the past. So we will link up all this stuff in the show notes so everybody can find all these resources.
It's been so empowering for us. Back in the old days, people didn't really think about these things so much, but now it's front and center, and there are such fantastic ways of replacing all the bad stuff. So instead of feeling deprived, you're feeling like you're on an adventure, finding out new stuff.
Right. Great.
Okay, so let's shift gears here for a second. Let's talk about cholesterol metabolism, because there's a whole bunch of confusion in the cholesterol world as well, as you know. So in the world of cholesterol metabolism, the U.S. dietary guidelines have now lifted any of their suggestions about how much cholesterol to eat. We're currently being told that cholesterol in your food does not affect the cholesterol in your bloodstream. True or false?
Well, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, actually, because the government reversed itself. And now all those warnings are back in place. In fact, they're actually stronger than they were before, which is good. So if you're feeling confused, join the club. Everybody's like, what is going on here? You got like scientific whiplash here. Here's what actually happened. What really goofed things up was in 2015, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee issued a report that said exactly what you just said. They said, we've looked at the data, and cholesterol in foods doesn't really affect your blood cholesterol very much. What they were responding to was the egg industry, which it has the foods that are highest in cholesterol. They went on the warpath. They wanted to say, cholesterol isn't really such a big issue. And so they convinced the committee to make this judgment. However, as soon as they made that judgment, we dug through the literature, and here's the way it works. If I take a person who's not eating any cholesterol, you're not eating any eggs, and you give that person an egg every day, or 2 or 3 eggs, whatever it is, their cholesterol level goes up noticeably. It goes right up. However, as an experiment, you could give them just cholesterol, not an egg. I mean, pure crystalline cholesterol, which you can add to certain test meals. And you show that the cholesterol you eat, about half of it gets into your blood cholesterol goes up. In the same way as you eat sugar, your blood sugar goes up. Sure. If you eat cholesterol, does your blood cholesterol go up? Of course it does. However, if I do a study where I bring in people who are already eating a lot of cholesterol already, they're eating 3 or 4 eggs a day, they're eating sausage and whatever, and I give that person another egg every day, you don't see much of any effect. It's sort of like if I'm smoking a pack a day and I had 2 more cigarettes a day, you're not going to really see it, or it's not going to be statistically significant. That's the kind of studies that the egg industry was funding. And in the past 10 years or more, the egg industry is the prime funder of dietary cholesterol research. So we brought all this information to the USDA and Department of Health and Human Services. And when the final dietary guidelines came out, everyone was wondering if they would keep that limit of 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol per day, which had been in place for a long time. They did scrap the limit, but what they actually said is that dietary cholesterol is a problem, and you should eat not 300 milligrams a day, but as little as possible, meaning 0. The way I interpret it. So they didn't set any limit. They said you should eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible. How much is possible? 0. You don't eat any. So I'm interpreting that to mean that the egg industry was rebuffed, that we were right. But the lesson here is that industry is using science to try to keep people confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, amen to that. There's a lot of ethics involved in this sort of marketing of, various macronutrients or, foods high in cholesterol and or, protein and saturated fat into our diet. And I think you're hitting the head on that. So let me ask you this. How much cholesterol is actually necessary in your diet?
Well, 0. You don't need any. Now, your body makes cholesterol, and it's important that your body make it. Your body, the cells of your body make cholesterol. The liver makes most of it, but the other body cells make it. And the reason they're making it is it goes into the cell membranes and keeps them flexible. If you were a potted plant and you're just rigid all day, you don't really need it. Plants don't have cholesterol, but you are a mobile, flexible human being, or all animals. Cholesterol keeps the cell membranes flexible. It's also used as a raw material to make hormones like estrogens or testosterone. Progesterone, they're made out of cholesterol. Vitamin D has cholesterol as key ingredient in making it. So your body makes a little bit of cholesterol for all those things, and it makes all you need. And suddenly when a person says, I think I'll have some shrimp and some lobster and I'll have a steak, and those are animal products. So you're getting their cholesterol added to your cholesterol, and it becomes too much. And about half of the cholesterol you eat ends up in the blood. You get an excess of cholesterol in your bloodstream, and some of it oxidizes and damages the arterial lining. So the answer is don't eat someone else's cholesterol. Stick with the cholesterol your body has been making, and for the most part, you're going to be okay. I mean, that's the cholesterol that you need without the excess.
Got it. Now, in the paleo movement, you'll see a lot of people can actually reduce their cholesterol with a paleo diet. How can this happen?
Well, it can happen in 2 ways. First is, even though I'm saying the paleo diet is not really the way to go, for some people, it might be better than what they were on before, because the paleo idea is that there was some romantic time after we learned to kill animals and hunt, but before we figured out how to plant a seed. That's what they're basically saying. So I'm a hunter, but I'm not going to grow anything. And there's this sort of imaginary band of time when people were like that. And they say, well, people didn't milk cows until way after that, so they're getting the dairy out. And if dairy, which it is, happens to be the #1 source of bad fat in the diet and very high in cholesterol, if you're not eating cheese, that's good. Where they go wrong is they imagine people to have been really good hunters, which people really have not been. And in fact, if you look prior to the Stone Age, if you don't have arrowheads, and you don't have hatchets and tools, basically, which our forebears did not have, hunting was extremely inefficient. I mean, just head out with no tools. It's, figure out when you're going to catch anybody. It doesn't, but picking plants and so forth is something a primate can quite easily do. You don't have to sneak up on a strawberry. It's very simple. So that's the thing with the paleo diet. The other thing about it is, so the first thing is they're not eating dairy. The second thing about it is that anytime people pay attention to what they're eating and they're attentive to it, sometimes their calorie intake will drop. If I throw out all the sugar and stuff because I'm trying to be on this healthy diet that I read about in Men's Health, sometimes their caloric intake will fall and they will lose weight. And when they lose weight, their cholesterol levels will fall. Things will get better. You take that same person, you put them on a vegan diet, and you say, eat healthy plant foods. Then suddenly, it's like pedal to the metal. Everything gets dramatically better. And their cholesterol is going to really go through the floor. Their health is going to rebound much better.
Yeah, I always like to tell people there's no benefit you can get on that approach that you can't get on this approach plus some. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it's a funny thing. We have this funny idea. Guys, I mean, what can you say? We have this idea, if I eat, some of that will make me more macho. In the same ideas, if I eat brains, maybe I'll be smarter. But if you look at the most macho animals, a bull, a stallion, an elephant, a giraffe, the most muscular animals, they're all vegan. You can't say to a bull, hey, you might be a little bit more muscular if you eat a burger or some bacon.
Mm-hmm.
I say, wait a minute, my metabolism gives me these muscles based on a plant-based diet. And human beings, whether we like it or not, are great apes. And we're designed for an herbivorous diet.
So one of my favorite things that I've heard you talk about in the past that I think is worth mentioning here is HDL cholesterol, because I think there's also kind of a misinterpretation about the value of HDL cholesterol. So, physicians in particular, they tell their patients, they say, hey, listen, as long as your HDL cholesterol is moving upwards, then that means that your cholesterol metabolism is getting healthier over time. But you and I know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So can you kind of explain what's the role of HDL cholesterol, and is it even worth paying attention to?
HDL cholesterol is the good cholesterol, high density lipoprotein. It's called good because it's supposedly it's removing cholesterol from the body as opposed to LDL, which is the bad cholesterol. And up until fairly recently, people would say, all right, you do want a low total cholesterol. True enough. You want a low LDL because LDL is bad. You want to keep that low, and that's true enough. But the idea was you want to have a high HDL. That would be protective. Here's where we ran into trouble. First of all, when people go on a plant-based diet, they don't have much of any kind of cholesterol in their body. And Dean Ornish has a great explanation where he'll say, let's say your total cholesterol is 120. And your LDL is 90 or something like that, your HDL is going to be pretty low. He'll say the HDLs are garbage trucks carrying away the garbage, but you just don't have much garbage to carry away, so your HDL is low. And those people are very low risk of heart disease, even though their HDL is not very high. Second thing that happened more recently is researchers have tested compounds that lower HDL. I'm talking about a pharmaceutical that will raise your HDL. And they found that they don't have any benefit. So we knew that lowering LDL by diet or even by pharmaceuticals would reduce your risk of heart disease. But the idea that HDL was good and a high HDL would help you, when it's been augmented pharmacologically, it hasn't shown any benefit. So that's where people are kind of scratching their heads. So LDL is every bit as bad as we ever thought it was, but whether maintaining a high HDL really matters, jury's, in my view, still out.
Right. Okay. Many people nowadays argue that since your brain is made up of fatty acids and cholesterol, you must eat these to have a healthy brain. What do you say?
Well, that's kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. You don't need to eat these things because your body makes them, and it makes the ones that you need. And by the way, you do need a certain amount of fat in your diet. But if you send a leaf of spinach or broccoli to a laboratory, they'll call you up. And they'll say, it's about 7 or 8% fat. It's not much, but there are traces of fats in vegetables, in beans, in fruits. Those are the traces that your body really does need. And you have then enzymes that take the this will not be on the test, the alpha-linolenic acid, that is the fat that your body needs. And they elongate them to make the longer chain omega-3s that are natural for you. Except if you eat a lot of other fats that interfere and get in the way, then that's not good. So you want to have a diet based on natural vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans. That gives you those traces of fat, and there's not a lot of competing fats to get in the way.
Got it. All right, you gave us a lot of really great information here about cholesterol, but just in the most succinct summary you can get, what's the one thing that you want people to walk away knowing about cholesterol?
Your body makes all the cholesterol you need, and you don't need to add any more to it. And it's good to avoid animal products, because that means there's no cholesterol in your diet and there's none of that animal fat that stimulates the cholesterol manufacture.
Perfect. Okay, so now let's tie insulin resistance, what we talked about earlier, together with cholesterol metabolism, because there's an interplay between these two, metabolisms or programs, we'll call them. So we established earlier that eating saturated fat increases insulin resistance, but we also know that saturated fat can actually affect your cholesterol levels as well. So can you go in a little bit of detail about how saturated fat affects your cholesterol?
Yeah, when you consume foods that are high in saturated fat, that's dairy number one, but meat is right there too. That saturated fat turns on the body's mechanisms for manufacturing extra cholesterol. So you didn't eat this cholesterol, your body made it, but it made it in response to the fat that you're eating. So there's something about a high saturated fat diet that starts to elevate the bad cholesterol levels in the blood. The beauty of it is that you don't have to have one diet to avoid dietary cholesterol and another diet to avoid saturated fat. Animal products contain both of those bad actors, and when you avoid those, you avoided both the dietary cholesterol and the saturated fat.
Pretty simple. Does unsaturated fat also cause insulin resistance?
Short answer, who knows? My guess is that it may do so, but probably to a lesser degree than saturated fat. If I'm reading the literature correctly, the saturated fats seem to be the really bad actor. But on the other hand, if you're taking that bottle of even olive oil and going glug, 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 glug all over your pasta, my guess is that fat's going to get into your cells and cause problems too.
Right. And there's also a third type of fat, which we haven't even talked about, which are trans fats, which are basically man-made fats.
Yeah.
In a laboratory. So
they act very much like saturated fat with regard to their effect on cholesterol and other things, and they should be avoided. Interestingly enough, although most of them are man-made, you take oils and you add hydrogen atoms to the fat molecule, and that's why it's called hydrogenated. It turns this liquid oil into this waxy solid. Interestingly enough, that very same thing happens in a cow's digestive tract. They create trans fats. And so in milk products, you will see a little bit of what are called natural trans fats, but it looks like they're just as bad as the trans fats that you would get out of a factory.
From a manufacturing process, right?
Yeah, exactly. The amount is low, but there is no reason to subject yourself to them.
So if you had to give somebody some recommendations for how they could make themselves truly heart disease proof or really dramatically reduce their risk for heart disease, do you have some numbers for what should your total cholesterol be, your LDL, your HDL, and your triglycerides?
The typical lab slip that the doctor gives you says get your total cholesterol under 200. I would cross that number out and put in probably 150. However, it's amazing. You'll see some people who are way lower than that. And by the way, once in a while you'll have a person who will say, my doctor got nervous because my total cholesterol is only 110. And so what can I eat to get my cholesterol back up? Don't worry about that. Not to worry. So for LDL, so anyway, that's the total, I would say 150 or less, just as a broad brush stroke. For LDL, roughly 100 or less. Some people would say 90. It's hard to get, some people would say 80, someone would say 70, but 100 is a reasonable round figure. Triglycerides, somewhere in the 100, 150 range, somewhere in there. But man, can they go all over the map. I mean, you'll see people with 1,000, 2,000 triglycerides, which is like super, super high. But once you're in those lower ranges, I wouldn't worry too much, and I wouldn't get tested every 2 weeks because your numbers are going to bounce around a lot, depending on what you've been doing and depending on your activity and depending on what you're eating and stress levels and all kinds of stuff.
So one thing that we have seen with a lot of our clients, and that I know that a lot of people who transition towards a more plant-focused or plant-based diet also see, is that their triglyceride levels actually go up. So their LDL levels come down. Their their total cholesterol comes down, but their triglycerides go in the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
do you have any insight as to why that may be happening?
It's interesting. If you look at people who have been on a plant-based diet over the long term, their triglycerides are actually low. If you look at them during the transition, sometimes they bump up a little bit. And we saw that especially in Dean Ornish's studies, that triglycerides would go up. And I've seen that in some of our studies too. I did a follow-up study not too many years ago where I asked people to follow a vegan diet that was also low in fat, but I added the glycemic index to it. So what I was doing is, instead of having, say, white bread as an obvious example, I would ask them to have, say, rye bread or pumpernickel bread, because those have less glycemic effect. They don't raise your blood sugar as much. And suddenly we saw everybody's triglycerides going down. So my guess is that it's a temporary phenomenon when you see it, and that for some people, it can be the higher glycemic index foods. And so what are those, by the way? Wheat bread, surprisingly, even if it's whole wheat bread, rye or pumpernickel have less glycemic effect. Cold cereals are high glycemic index, especially if they have a toy inside. So oatmeal or bran cereal is better. It's lower GI. Big white potatoes tend to boost your blood sugar pretty rapidly. And all that, it doesn't mean they're unhealthy, but it means that they release their glucose rather quickly. So you get a glycemic load that is more than the body can handle. And so it's probably converting some of that to triglyceride temporarily. On the other hand, take a sweet potato, your body digests it more slowly, the glucose is released more gradually, and you don't seem to see that effect. Sugar itself, of course, tends to be high GI. Fruit is sweet, but it tends to be low GI. So you just pick the low GI foods, and I think most people are going to set aside that triglyceride issue.
Fantastic. Okay. So if you, hypothetical situation, you're on death row, you get one last meal.
What's my last meal?
It's your last meal.
Well, I'm going to pick a meal from Fargo, North Dakota. First of all, it's going to take several days to get it to me wherever I am, so that would be a plus. Secondly, when I was a kid growing up on Main, I grew up in North Dakota, and on Main Avenue in Fargo was a place called the Mexican Village, still there today, where they'll take a tortilla and they wrap it up with beans and jalapeno peppers. And if you leave off the cheese, it happens to be vegan, always have. It has this beautiful light tomato sauce on top. They throw it in an oven at like 600 degrees, and it comes out. It's this old, traditional Latin American dish made of these simplest foods, just a tortilla and some beans and some jalapenos, and that might be my death row dinner.
When was the last time you actually ate that?
As a matter of fact, I was in Fargo about a month ago, and I went there to the same old place that had been there since I was in high school, and I had that, but I didn't realize you'd ask me about death row, so I'm going to tell the server next time I'm there to keep one in the fridge for me.
Yeah, you never know when it's going to come in handy.
Yeah, you never know.
Okay, so for our listeners at home, okay, they want to know what is Dr. Barnard's recommendation. So if in 60 seconds, can you tell people with diabetes what dietary modifications they should make in order to start seeing results and improvement in their blood glucose values and insulin resistance tomorrow?
All right, good. First of all, keep in mind where we're trying to go with this. We're trying to get the fat out of your cells so that your insulin can start working again. That's the key. And if you got type 1, I want to do the same thing because I want to stop the assault on the blood vessels. That's the damage of type 1. Okay, so if I want to get the fat out of my cells, what I need to do is eat foods that really don't have much fat in them. And that's vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans. And all the healthy things that they can turn into, whether it's an Italian pasta dish or my Mexican bean burrito or a chili or whatever it might be. So vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans. Do take vitamin B12 as well. I think that's really important for everybody, and every drugstore and health food store sells it. Get some exercise. When you're having these foods, always have the healthiest ones, not adding lots of junk to them. Put it together. It's really pretty simple.
It's great. So, but again, I know we've been over this, but I just want to make it clear. You're telling people that have diabetes, they have type 2, they're already type 1, they have high blood glucose they're on Medicaid. You're telling them to eat carbohydrates. You're saying potatoes are okay, beans are okay, rice is okay, fruit is okay.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. And that's really important, because the person who is going to fail is the person who got that message that carbohydrates are somehow terrible, and they're avoiding the very food that is going to give your cells the fuel that they need. And when I say carbohydrates, I'm not referring to sugar per se. What I'm saying is that fruits and vegetables, the whole grains and beans, are the foods your body was designed for. Your body is designed to extract that carbohydrate, pull the glucose out of it, and put it into your cells. And the only reason that the carbohydrate, the glucose, can't get into your cells is that cells have accumulated fat. So you get the fat out of the diet, you eat these healthy foods, and your cells are going to work better. Again, if you got type 1, the cells that make insulin are gone. And so you'll continue to need a source of insulin, but you don't want any cholesterol in your diet, because what hurts a person with type 1 is blood vessel disease. So you don't want any animal fat, you don't want any cholesterol, and you're going to discover that you live a normal life if you're eating a healthy diet. Plus, for some reason, insulin requirements go way down. It's amazing. I was talking with a woman this morning who was on type 1. She just transitioned to a vegan diet a month or two ago. She was on 18 units less insulin. We see that all the time. I know you see that with people too. So low-fat, plant-based diet, it is higher in carbohydrates. Everyone gets nervous. But don't worry, this is what your body was designed for. And within the first week, you're going to know you're right.
Yeah, one of the things that we do a lot is we try and teach people how to calculate their 24-hour insulin sensitivity, which is the total number of grams of carbohydrate you eat divided by the total number of units of insulin you're using, which is a combination of both your basal and your bolus together. And what we see is that people who come into our program, or people who are on a sort of like meat-centric diet, they start out with a 24-hour insulin sensitivity of like 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1. Then they come through and they start to change their diet. They drop their fat intake. Their insulin requirements go way down. Their carbohydrate goes way up. As a result of that, that 3-to-1 ratio becomes an 8-to-1, a 10-to-1, a 20-to-1, a 26-to-1. And before they know it, they've increased their insulin sensitivity by like almost 1,000-fold. I'm sorry, 1,000%.
Yeah.
So it's really dramatic, just like you're saying. You know, it applies to people with prediabetes and type 2, but it also absolutely applies to people with type 1.
Well, here's what you did. You brought them in, you threw open the hood, you cleaned out their engine, and suddenly that fuel can go right in where it belongs. They never knew that was possible. And people should be forgiven for that. When I was in medical school, I was taught diabetes is a one-way street, can never get better. You're going to have complications, and they're eating for their medication. What I mean is you're on 20 units of insulin or whatever it is. And so don't eat too little carbohydrate, don't eat too much. And you're trying to avoid hypoglycemia. And the whole idea is not to use foods for health, but to use foods to try to placate your insulin dose. That is not the way to deal with it. Anyway, the answer is a healthy plant-based diet. And if you put that to work consistently day after day, you're going to do really well.
Well, thanks for taking the time to be here with us today. I mean, this is it's super informative, and you know your experience is just untold. I mean, you're very eloquent at telling stories and relaying it in a very manageable fashion. So I hope the people who are listening to this actually are able to put Dr. Barnard's recommendations into play, because you will see change immediately.
Well, the only well, first of all, thank you for that. And one last thing I might just ask listeners is please make some noise about this. Spread the word to other people you know, because there are people who are really well educated but underserved. They haven't heard about this new approach to diabetes, despite the fact that it has been done by the best researchers that we have on the planet. I'm talking about people at Yale University and others, and they're talking about this, saying, help people understand really the causes. So make some noise, spread the word, let's get the word out. I know you guys have been doing this for a long time, and you do it like nobody else. So thanks for letting me be part of it. And if everybody else joins the team, spreads the word, you're going to empower people like never before.